we were talking about, at the point of the opening, there had been a reinvestigation. Mr. Durst had just explained how he found out about it. Now, he says that...
John, can you move a little bit to the left?
Oh, sure. You know what? I think I have to move to the left, or they can't... I can't move to the right, because I have to be in the square.
Come up a little bit.
Yeah. Let me move this here.
Yeah, that's good.
Is that better? Okay. All right. So, although Mr. Durst says he found out about the reinvestigation on October 31st, 2000, we're going to produce evidence that shows he actually found out about it earlier. On October 23rd, so this is going to be 11 days before Mr. Durst allegedly found out that they were reinvestigating his wife's disappearance, he wrote himself a check for $9,000. Now, this would be the first of what would prove to be a pattern of what is called structuring money that Mr. Durst would do. And you're going to hear from not only Mr. Durst in the Galveston trial. This is Mr. Durst answering. If you cash a check for more than for $10,000, there's a big form that gets filled in, and it takes a long time, and it goes to some agency, some place or another. And I always paid a lot of bills with cash and stuff, restaurants and things like that. But when this first happened in November of 2000, when I first ever went bananas and came down here, I knew if I ever had to go into hiding, I would need cash. So I started withdrawing money from banks, and I sort of just kept doing it like on remote control or something like that. That's Mr. Durst's testimony from Galveston. So Mr. Durst was aware that there is a reporting issue when you take out more than $10,000 that is reported. So you're going to hear from FBI financial crimes analyst Eric Van Dorn. Now, Agent Van Dorn is going to testify that this structuring conduct started at the very latest October 23rd of 2000, and it continued through 2001. Now, in addition to the structuring, there was additional evidence that Mr. Durst was aware before October 31st, 2000 of the reinvestigation of Captain's disappearance. So on October 30th, 2000, this is the day before he allegedly found out about the reinvestigation, Mr. Durst executed the following document. This is a durable power of attorney that gave Mr. Durst, the woman who would become his wife, they were not legally married at this time, they would get married very soon after. This gave her power of attorney, in essence, over his money. Now, who is Debby Lee Sheridan? Debby Sheridan is an experienced real estate professional. She and Durst were introduced by Nick Chavin in 1988 and soon after began dating. In the early 1990s, Sheridan and Durst moved in together. After a year and a half living together, they decided to move out. So they had the relationship didn't end, it continued, but they were now living in separate places. The relationship continued after Durst left New York for Trinidad in 1995. In 1998, he began spending more time with Sheridan during his periodic visits to New York. On October 30th, 2000, again, the day before he allegedly found out about the reinvestigation, he gave Sheridan power of attorney. On November 2nd, 2000, allegedly Durst told Sheridan about the reinvestigation. On November 3rd, Durst asked Sheridan to marry him. This information regarding what's up here right now, the November 2nd and November 3rd items, those are coming from Mr. Durst himself, and I'll get to the document that establishes that. So that is what he is saying happened. On November 5th, 2000, Susan Berman authored a letter to Bobdor that outlined her financial difficulties. Although there is no direct evidence that Durst ever received this letter, 4 days later, in the midst of his panic about the reinvestigation, he did the following. So on November 9th, he sends Susan Berman a check for $25,000. This would not be the only check Durst would send to Susan shortly before her murder.
And then, so in November of 2000, did you send her this $25,000? Yeah, I send her, when I've been sending her periodically the $25,000. I sent her another one when the car broke. And they right within a couple of weeks.
So basically you sent her 50 altogether.
Yes, I sent her two $5,000 checks.
Right.
So the evidence is going to show that according to Mr. Durst's own testimony, he gave Susan Berman $50,000 roughly in the last little over a month of her life. Now on November 11th, 2000, this is when the media began reporting the reinvestigation. So remember, Mr. Durst said in the clip you heard yesterday that he had found out about the reinvestigation from a press person associated with the Durst organization who had told his sister Wendy, who had then told him. So in essence, the press person learned a little bit in advance before things were published that this was going to hit the media. On November 11, 2000, that's when the media began reporting the reinvestigation. This is what Mr. Durst's response was when the media began reporting.
And the whole idea of being charged with something, having people invest, and not so much investment, but that people are going to find me guilty. I mean, I've been guilty for years in the newspapers, et cetera, et cetera. Now they're really going to find me guilty. And if they don't find me guilty, I'm going to be in jail, you know, on whatever, before the trial, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what I did was I decided I got to go into hiding. And I had an apartment in Dallas. I'd been to Galveston, Texas a bunch of times. It seemed like about as good a place to hide as there was in the world.
Now the evidence is going to show that upon hearing about the reinvestigation, Mr. Durst went into a panic.
I flew to Dallas. Excuse me. Got the car, drove to, the car was in the garage in the building I had in Dallas. Drove to Galveston, which is 4.5 hours or so, with the intention of hiding and living in Galveston the rest of my life, or whatever, or until this went away if nothing happened, whatever.
On November 15th of 2000, Durst rented this tiny apartment. This is like a it looks like a house, but it's an apartment house, and there are either 4 or 5 apartments in this location, and Bob Durst rented a very small apartment on the ground floor of this boarding house for $300 a month. Now, this tiny apartment, and it's actually a little deceiving in this picture, it looks bigger than it is. It's tiny. It is one room, which is the bedroom and the living room, etc. There's a very tiny kitchen, and there's literally a bathroom that you can barely fit in with a shower. The kitchen basically consists of a stove, and you got a bathroom, and that's where he lived. That's what he rented.
But you in Galveston, you talked about it, so it wasn't something that you tried to.
I didn't tell anybody, right?
Oh, let me back up. I apologize. When Mr. Durst rented the apartment in Galveston, he did so disguised as a mute woman.
But you in Galveston, you talked about it, so it wasn't something that you tried to.
I didn't tell anybody my name was Robert Durst.
Right.
I didn't use my checks, my credit cards, my telephone, any of that.
So basically, Mr. Durst is going to Galveston. I got a little bit ahead. I thought that slide was something else that it wasn't. Mr. Durst goes to Galveston. He realizes, I don't want to use my name. I don't want to use my phone. I want to be invisible in Galveston. And in an attempt to hide his true identity, what he did is something the evidence will show that he does frequently in his life. He assumed somebody's identity, somebody that he knew. In this case, he disguised himself as a woman, Dorothy Seiner, and this was a classmate of his from high school. This is a real person. We have a stipulation on her testimony, but in essence, she didn't give Bob permission to use her name, didn't know that he was using it, but that's what he did. Now, Mr. Durst has a very masculine sounding voice. He's got a deep voice that you all heard, and obviously it's not really consistent with being a woman. So he decided that he would pretend to be mute. I want to be clear about something. There is no, crazy, Bob Durst just dressing up as a woman and et cetera, et cetera. That was going to be very simple. Bob Durst decided that he wanted to blend in, and he didn't want to be seen, and so he said, you know what, if I dress up as an older woman, no one's going to look at me.
It's not easy to disguise yourself. I'm a guy, and what is a guy going to do? I mean, I could grow a beard and a mustache, and I periodically worn a beard and a mustache in New York City, but I can't grow a beard and a mustache now. Can't do it by tomorrow morning. I would have to get some kind of a thing to put on my face, and I just couldn't imagine that any of that would act vaguely real. I just came up with the idea of a wig.
Now,
Went to Dallas, went to the apartment, went to a wig store, tried on the wig, and I said, gosh, this looks pretty good. I got the hair here, the hair here. A good shave. I'm going to be looking sort of like a woman. Or if not just like a woman, close enough.
so on December 4th, 2000, this is when the story of the reinvestigation went national with a People magazine article. So all of a sudden it went from kind of a New York story to a national story. On December 6, 2000, concerned that he was about to be arrested, Mr. Durst took a 36-hour Greyhound bus ride to New York City. So instead of getting on a plane, which he usually did, he basically took a very circuitous route because he thought he was about to be arrested and charged with Kathy's murder. On December 11, 2000, in the middle of all this, Durst decides to marry his longtime girlfriend, Debby Sheridan. The wedding was officiated by a rabbi they picked out of the phone book. The only people present were Durst, Sheridan, the rabbi, and two witnesses who were chosen by the rabbi that they did not know. They were married in an office building. They did not spend their wedding night together, and Durst would explain the marriage, as had been quoted in the New York Post, as a marriage of convenience.
Durst's sister Wendy Krieger Durst. Why did you give her, Deborah, Durst's wife, the power? If you go to jail for the rest of your life, you've got power of attorney. Durst, it was a marriage of convenience. I had to have Deborah to write my checks. I was setting myself up to be a fugitive, which is what I was doing when I went to Galveston right from the very beginning. I was setting myself up to be a fugitive.
So as part of the reopening of Kathy's disappearance, investigators wanted to speak to Bob's close friend, Susan Berman. This is investigator Joey Becerra from the New York State Police. The hair, it's always like that. It doesn't move. It just, it's great hair. Detective Becerra. Detective Becerra was the lead investigator on the reinvestigation, and he's going to testify in this case, and that's what he's going to tell you.
When I started speaking with Kathy's friends, they all said to me that I should speak to Susan Berman, that she was a very close friend of Bobby's, that they were close since college, that when Kathy went missing, she protected Bobby from the press, and they basically told me if anyone knows anything about Kathy's disappearance, it would be Susan Berman.
You're going to hear evidence in this case that when investigators are investigating a homicide case, especially when they're investigating a case where the suspect is out of custody, is loose, what they do is they go from out in. So they first contact individuals that they know or believe have no contact with the suspect because they want to make sure that he doesn't get tipped off. Eventually, that circle gets tighter and tighter, and they have to start contacting people who might end up tipping off the suspect. Susan Berman was of extreme interest to the detectives, but they were waiting to contact her very near the end because of the closeness of the relationship. Now, very important to note, as Detective Becerra can tell you, they never made contact with Susan Berman prior to her murder. They never contacted her. They were planning on it, but no contact was made. However, despite having never been contacted by investigators, Susan lied to Bob Durst and told him that she had been contacted and planned to speak with the investigators. Now, how do we know this? We know this directly from Bob Durst.
But you heard from her that she had been contacted by the police?
Yes.
What did she say, if you remember?
He said, the Los Angeles police contacted me. They want to talk to me about Susie Berman. I think I and you were going to be best off if I just talked to them.
She said they want to talk to me about Susie Berman.
I'm sorry. Susie Berman said the police are contacting, the Los Angeles police are contacting me. They want to talk to me about Kathy Durst's disappearance. Mm-hmm. And this was probably before the PR guy told me that the newspapers are doing these articles.
Now, the evidence will demonstrate that it was that conversation, that statement by Susan Berman to Bob Durst that sealed her fate.
That's already on the move. That clearly already. That's a conclusion. That's his conclusion, of course. But it's already. Moment.
Okay. Durst confirmed this information. And again, most of the information you'll get from Bob Durst, it doesn't just come once. Meaning it's not as if you're listening to Mr. Durst and, okay, he made a comment, but it's misunderstood. Almost every key piece of evidence you will see in this case, Mr. Durst actually corroborates more than once. And when I interviewed him in 2015 in the New Orleans jail, this conversation came up again. And again,
Susan told you that the police...
Back up, I'm sorry. At the time that Mr. Durst is given this information, you're about to hear me tell Mr. Durst, you know, Susan Berman was never contacted. The evidence is going to demonstrate that's the first time that Bob Durst realized, oh, the police never talked to her.
Susan told you that the police had contacted her, remember?
Yeah.
And she told you, do you remember, who did she tell you contacted her? When you told us to Mark Manager.
Susan told me that she'd been contacted by Los Angeles detectives and New York detectives, and they want to come talk to me.
And if I asked you on a scale of 1 to 100, with 1 being I'm not sure she said it, and 100 being I'm positive, you would say...
Said what?
That Susan told you that?
Yes.
100, right?
Susan definitely told me that she'd been contacted by...
A moment later, this is when it was presented to Mr. Durst that, you know what, they never contacted her, and listen to his response.
I'm going to tell you something. That wasn't true. They had not contacted her. They were planning to contact her. They had never contacted her. Oh, you know what? That might have come out in the... You knew that before I just said it right now because it came out in the show, right? Has that already come out or no? I can't remember what's out in the show. Did you know what I just told you or no? Is that a new piece?
No, I did not know that they had not contacted.
No, they had not contacted. They were planning on it. So I'm trying to figure out why would Susan tell you that if it hadn't happened? I mean, any idea?
If the detectives had not called her,
Then.
Now, Durst further explained that he and Susan had agreed during that phone call when she had said that she had been contacted, that they had agreed, okay, go ahead and speak to them.
And did you have any feeling about what she was doing in talking to the police? Did you feel like she was...
She said, Bobby, it's going to be best for both of us if I just talk to them. All right, what am I going to say? No. Talk to them.
Was there anything that Susan knew about you, your history, Kathy, no Kathy, whatever it was there anything that Susan knew as your sort of confidant that you would have been uncomfortable with her telling the police?
Well, we had lots of private things, but none of it had anything to do with Kathy. I mean, when Kathy was, going bananas, we would talk about Kathy all the time. I couldn't imagine her talking to the police about that, just sitting here right now. But the police want to talk to me, I'm just going to talk to them. Is that all right? And like that was the conversation. Do whatever you want.
Mm-hmm. And then something happens to Susan then.
She was murdered.
During that exchange, Mr. Durst said, she said, Bobby, it's going to be best for both of us if I just talk to them. And all right, what am I going to say? No, talk to them. Now the evidence is going to show, although he told her, go talk to them, he also decided to kill her. Now, during the interview in New Orleans, Mr. Durst revealed some information about Susan Berman that really illustrates why it was that he decided to kill her.
In the All Good Things, when they interviewed Steve Silverman, he says that Susan Berman is the last person you would want to confess a murder to.
Now the evidence is going to show that Mr. Durst was aware that Susan Berman, although loyal, was not the best at keeping secrets. Now what the evidence will also show is that he did not realize that prior to killing her, that she had already told all of those people that we've already discussed. Now on December 12, 2000, we are now on the countdown. Susan is going to get murdered the night of the 22nd, the morning of the 23rd. So we're now roughly 10 days before she's going to be killed. Durst bought a one-way ticket from New York City to Eureka, California, with a transfer in San Francisco. And this was for travel on December 14th. Now, when Mr. Durst is living in Trinidad, which is basically up by Eureka, it doesn't have a big airport. So if you want to go into Trinidad, especially if you're flying from New York, you fly into San Francisco, and then you take a small plane to the Eureka Arcata Airport, and then Trinidad is a small distance away from Eureka. It's an even smaller city. So Mr. Durst buys this ticket on December 12, 2000. It is one way. However, he never took this flight. 7 days later, on December 19, 2000, he used the ticket and he flew from New York to Eureka with a transfer of planes in San Francisco.
Now, the New York police, I think, made a big deal out of the idea that you had gone to California around the time that Susan Berman was murdered, but...
I got there a long time before December 23rd, a long time before Christmas.
You got to?
I got to California from... Now I'm trying to remember where I was. I would have been... Yeah, I would have been in New York. I flew to... The way to get to Trinidad, you fly to San Francisco from anywhere, and then you fly to Eureka, and then you drive the 10 miles to Trinidad. And I went from New York through just what I just described, and I'm guessing I was there for, I don't know, a couple of weeks or something like that.
Now the evidence is going to show that when Mr. Durst is hit with information is confronted with information that is damaging and that he can't explain, and he almost goes on autopilot. He will continue talking, but he won't necessarily answer the question that he's being asked. When he was hit with the issue of his travel in the last statement, what he started to say was, the way you get to Trinidad, you fly from San Francisco to New York, not answering the question, he's just saying things. You're going to see as you listen to other statements and other times he's confronted, you will see that pattern repeat. Now, Mr. Durst at the end of that said, oh, I was there about 2 weeks. Well, at his murder trial in Galveston in 2003, Durst testified that he stayed at his house in Trinidad the entire trip. So he got to Trinidad and he never left. That was sworn testimony in Trinidad. In Galveston, excuse me. However, he also testified that the trip was only 3 days long. Now, this document you're seeing, and I'm going to get to it a little bit later, this is a document that we refer to as the BD story. It is a document that was authored by Bob Durst himself as he awaited trial in Galveston. Now, the BD story, the evidence is going to show, basically served as a checklist of the information known or that could be proven by the authorities in Galveston. It's kind of like a check. It's a timeline saying, here's what they know, here's what can be proven. Now, although much of the information in the BD story is accurate, the evidence will also show that it is filled with numerous self-serving lies and also some damaging omissions which will be proven other ways. Now, in the BD story, Mr. Durst says he flew on December 19 to Eureka, California. And the evidence is going to show that that is absolutely true. You're going to hear a stipulation for Ross Vitale, who was the owner-operator of the shuttle that would pick Mr. Durst up. So what happened was Mr. Durst would fly into San Francisco, and remember, he owned a house in Trinidad. He would fly from San Francisco to Trinidad, and then he would have Ross Vitale pick him up at Trinidad. So Mr. Vitale knew Mr. Durst. And one of the things Mr. Vitale is going to tell you in terms of how to remember Mr. Durst is Mr. Durst was a very bad tipper. And he remembered that. Now, on December 19, 2000 at 3:56 p.m., Vitale personally picked up Durst from the Arcadia Airport. He then drove Durst to the Harper Ford Service Department, where Durst retrieved the keys to his Ford Explorer. Now, Bob Durst owned a 1995 Ford Explorer, but because he traveled all around, rather than kind of keep the keys with him, he had arranged to have the keys kept at the Ford dealership. He would keep the car parked at the airport, and if he came to Eureka, he'd be picked up by Vitale, driven to the Harper Ford Service Center. He'd get the keys to the car, and then he'd come back to the airport to get the car. So they pick up the keys. Vitale then drives Durst back to the airport, and Durst picks up his Ford Explorer that's parked in the airport garage. Now, we have a stipulation regarding the testimony of the person who was working in the parking garage at the time. And what the records are going to demonstrate is that the Ford Explorer was not parked in the parking lot from December 20th through December 31st of 2000. So it was gone. It was there before, and it was gone after. Now, the BD story also says that he was in December 20th, 21st, and 22nd of 2000. Remember, he flies to San Francisco on the 19th, takes the small plane to Trinidad, to Eureka Airport on the 19th, and he says on the 20th, 21st, and 22nd, he says he was in Eureka, Garbersville, in Trinidad. Well, Eureka's the airport. Trinidad's where he lives. What's Garbersville? Well, Mr. Durst, by the time he's authoring the BD story, knows that detectives have gone back and they have been able to trace a phone call that Mr. Durst made. The evidence is going to show that what Mr. Durst did was he had a voicemail account. And although he was not using his cell phone, he would use a phone to call the voicemail, which was connected to all of his phones, and he would check his voicemail messages. So there's a calling card that the detectives found, and they were able to determine that he had made phone calls checking his voicemail from Garbersville, California on December 20th. Now remember, Mr. Durst testified in Galveston under oath that he never left Trinidad. So the BD story, although it's prepared in preparation for the Galveston trial, Mr. Durst is aware of it. He testifies differently than his own notes. Okay. The call that we're talking about was placed from Garbersville. Now, Garbersville is a town that is 90 miles south of Trinidad. So, if you're looking at Northern California, Trinidad is north. Eureka and Trinidad are north of San Francisco on the 101, in essence. So basically, if you are taking the 101 south from Eureka, Trinidad, you could be going to San Francisco, or you could be going to Los Angeles, because San Francisco is in between. Now, Mr. Durst was asked about this trip and what he was doing during the 2015 interview with me in New Orleans.
So, with Susan, when you end up, we know that you flew out here to see her. Flew out to Los Angeles. San Francisco on December 19th, right? We have you made the call for the plane, right? You went to Eureka, you went to the Ford dealership, right? You picked up the car, and then the next day, I don't know if you know this, you made phone calls for Garbersville. So where were you going? Why were you down there?
I don't remember what exactly I was doing in Garberville, and I tried to remember. I really don't know.
You weren't going to San Francisco, though, right? Because you had just come from San Francisco the day before, so that doesn't make sense.
I wasn't going to San Francisco.
Now, he was asked specifically during that interview why he had gone to Eureka for only 4 days. Why did you fly from New York to go to Eureka?
So, what made you take a 4-day trip? What were you doing out there? Did you remember?
I think I was wrapping up my affairs. I had sold the house.
Right.
I still had an office.
Right.
I still had a car. And I think I went out there to take my stuff out of the office. It was rented. And to sell the car.
So during this interview, Mr. Durst acknowledged that he had originally said that he'd been in California for a couple of weeks. You heard the clip. And he admitted, you know what, it's very unusual for him to go out there for only 4 days. And he also admitted, you know what, I can't tell you what I was doing out there.
You agree it was very strange for you to be going out here. When you were asked about it, you said you were out here for a couple of weeks. But,
yeah, that's what I thought.
Right, but you were only out there for 4 days.
4 days.
And you agreed you didn't take 4-day trips to San Francisco back then.
Not from New York.
Right.
No.
Yeah. So as you sit here, it's fair to say you really can't explain it.
I can't explain it.
Now remember, the BD story is written before the testimony in Galveston. You saw in the BD story, it's very clear that Mr. Durst indicates that he flew in the 19th and is there for 19th, 20th, 21st, and 22nd. So at the time that he testified in Galveston, he clearly was aware of what he had prepared prior to that, and he testified inconsistently with that. And now where I'm interviewing him, he's now saying, I can't explain it. I have no explanation. Now, during the trip to California, Durst continued to not use his cell phone. So the evidence is basically going to show that starting in basically around November 11th, right after, you remember, the story became national news. He takes off for Galveston, and he told you in the clip that you heard, I'm not gonna use my phone, I'm not gonna be Bob Durst, and he didn't use his cell phone. So his cell phone was not used during that trip. In addition, as had been his practice since fleeing to Galveston, Durst intentionally avoided using credit cards during the trip. Now, vehicle records also demonstrate that the mileage on Durst's Ford Explorer was consistent with a round trip between Eureka and Susan's home in Los Angeles. Now, how do we know that? And let me back up. So here's what the evidence is going to show. The distance from Garbersville to Beverly Hills round trip is roughly 1,150 miles. We know that on September 15th of 2000, that Durst had 30,378 miles on his Ford Explorer. And we know that because the Ford dealership serviced the car. We also know that on April 20th, 2001, that Mr. Durst's car was sold, and the mileage at that point was 31,847 miles. That's a total amount of 1,469 miles that were put on the car between September 15th and April 20th. But we know a lot more. We know that for the most part during that time, Mr. Durst did not have access to the car. He was gone. The car wasn't being driven. So when you add in, if you put in the 1,000 roughly 150 miles that it would have taken to drive down to from Garbersville to Beverly Hills and then back to San Francisco, that then gives a difference of roughly, let me get back here, math is not my thing. I have this down. It leaves you, I think, approximately 300 miles, which is more consistent with the kind of driving Mr. Durst was doing. So what the evidence is going to show is that all of a sudden, Mr. Durst has this giant amount of miles that are put on his car. Now, we know that he drove the car down to Garbersville, and we don't have any explanation why he's going there. The evidence is going to demonstrate that he drove the car down to Los Angeles, murdered Susan Berman, and then drove it back up to San Francisco. Now, on December 23rd of 2000, and again, this is from the BD story, we know that Mr. Durst says in the BD story, and this is true, he flew back to New York City. So this is December 23rd. We know that Susan Berman is already dead at this point in time. She's lying dead in her residence, but her body hasn't been found yet. Now we know that Bob Durst went to the ticket counter the night of the 23rd at San Francisco International Airport, and he purchased a ticket on a red-eye flight at the counter, departing 2 hours later in New York City. We know that he also left the Ford Explorer in San Francisco. Now, the evidence is going to show that Bob Durst doesn't buy tickets at the counter, and he never flies on the red-eye. Now, he was confronted with this during the interview in New Orleans in 2015.
I think, Bob, that you drove down to Los Angeles, that you drove down there, and
Killed Susan.
I do.
Go back.
And so the other thing is, you know, you don't take red-eye flights very often. Did you know that?
Very infrequently.
You would agree, right? Almost never do you take a red-eye flight. Agreed?
Yes, yes.
So I was trying to figure out, and usually you don't buy your tickets right at the counter. Would you agree?
Usually I make reservations.
Right.
And
So what made you, so here's what's weird. You also had a pattern, which you've explained. You fly from Eureka, from San Francisco to Eureka, New York, San Francisco to Eureka, Eureka back to San Francisco, back to New York. So on December 23rd, you end up buying that ticket at 10 at night at the counter in San Francisco. You didn't fly for Eureka, so why was it that you bought straight from San Francisco? Why didn't you go back to Eureka? What were you doing that made you get down to San Francisco? And why? It just doesn't make sense. I was just trying to understand that.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm just not going to be able to answer that because I just don't.
Okay, that's fair. But you agree it's hard to explain.
Unusual.
So in the weeks leading up to Durst's trip to California, Susan told at least 2 of her friends that he would be coming down to Los Angeles over the holidays. This is Susan's friend, Al Cleathan. You're not going to hear Mr. Cleathan live. You're going to hear videotape testimony. Murder cases are very long. They involve a lot of witnesses, and Mr. Cleathan was a character. You're missing, he's a character. You're missing some very interesting testimony. You get to still hear it, but it's not the same as him being live. But in any event, you'll see it, but it's not the same as when he's here. Mr. Cleathan is going to testify that Susan referred to herself as his Jewish mother. Al was interested in writing, and Susan was assisting him in his efforts.
She said, Bobby was coming. Bobby is going to be a lot of fun. He's going to take us all out to dinner and have a big party, with some of our other friends, this producer guy, I don't even know his name. And it was going to be fun. Bobby's going to take care of everything.
And did she say he was coming to Los Angeles?
Yes.
Did she say when he was coming?
Around the holidays.
Okay. And by the holidays, what months are we referring to?
Yeah, it's Christmas.
Susan's friend Danny Goldberg also talked about Susan telling her that Bobdor was coming down over the holidays.
The last time you had contact with Susan, was it by phone or was it?
It was on the phone.
And do you know when that was?
It was, I think it was December of whatever year it was that she was killed. It certainly was after Thanksgiving because it was prior to my family going away for the holiday period, and so it's either very end of November or the first half of December.
And during that call, did she mention any future plans she had to see Robert Durst?
Yes.
What did she say to you?
She said that she was expecting to see him around the holidays.
Richard Markey was another friend of Susan's, and the evidence is going to show that other than her killer, Mr. Durst, he was the last person to see her alive. Again, there's been a stipulation, and his testimony will be coming in via videotape you'll be watching as you're seeing now.
What was the date that you were last with him?
December 22nd.
What year?
2000. 2000.
Okay. How did you get to? Where did you go to dinner first?
I'm forgetting the name of the restaurant, but it was on the 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica.
Okay. Does the Broadway Deli sound?
Yeah, that's the restaurant.
And how did you get there?
Susan picked me up, and we drove there in her car.
Your own kind of car?
In the Susan Trooper, I think.
Okay. And when she picked you up, where did she pick you up from?
My apartment.
And where did you guys go first?
To the restaurant on the 3rd Street Promenade.
Okay. Do you recall approximately what time it would have been that you had dinner?
No, but normal dinner time.
What did you guys discuss during dinner?
Our lives and careers.
Okay. You were talking earlier about there was some sort of negotiations she was having with the TV network.
Yes.
Tell us about that. Did this discussion occur over dinner?
Yes. When she was in negotiations, and she told me whatever the details of the negotiation were and asked my opinion on contract issues.
Okay. Were there other things you might have discussed as well?
Yes, we discussed the usual things that friends talk about, friends, family, whatever was current in our life right at that time.
Would you discuss Susan's stepchildren, Sarah and Mella?
Yes.
Do you recall if you discussed Susan's landlady, Lee Baskin, and Edmund?
Yes.
What did you guys discuss about her?
Susan had been essentially at war with her. She wanted to evict Susan. Susan hadn't paid the rent in a few months. And her landlord had taken steps. I don't remember specifics, but it was a confrontational situation between the two of them.
And based on your discussions at dinner with Susan that night, as of at least that night, was this confrontation still ongoing, or had it been resolved?
I think it had been resolved.
How so?
I think the money that Mr. Durst gave to her allowed her to settle whatever claims that the landlady had made on her.
And was she going to be able to stay in her home?
I believe so.
And this is all based on what she had told you?
Yes.
After dinner, is that when you guys went to the movies?
Yes.
How did you get there?
We walked 50 feet.
Okay. Do you remember what movie you guys saw?
Yes, it was Best in Show.
Did it appear Susan enjoyed the movie?
Yes.
Do you remember approximately what time the movie got out?
I don't.
Okay.
But mid-evening, 9 or 10 o'clock.
Okay. Do you recall where you guys went after the movie?
I think that was the end of the night. She dropped me back at my apartment.
Now the rest of the story is going to be presented circumstantially. What the circumstantial evidence is going to show that Susan went back home, she changed her clothing, and then at some time, either late that night or early in the morning, Bobdor showed up at her doorstep. She let him into the house. She turned around to go deal with her dogs, and he pulled out a 9mm handgun and he executed her. He shot her point blank the back of her head. The evidence is going to show that Susan has no defensive wounds. There was no sign of a struggle. Her hands up. The evidence is going to show that she was murdered by somebody who she truly trusted, who she let into her home, and who she had no fear of whatsoever. Now, we know that sometime on December 23rd, 2000, the cadaver note was processed at the Marina del Rey Postal Annex. And you'll see that the postmark has faded away, and there's going to be evidence, and there's a stipulation that even though you can't see the postmark, there's a stipulation that it was postmarked December 23rd. There was a witness who had done an analysis, tried to get fingerprints and DNA, off of the envelope. They couldn't get anything. Tried to get fingerprints. They couldn't get anything. And when they used fingerprint powder, it ends up changing the color. But there's a stipulation, so it's been agreed upon that it was processed December 23rd. Now that's really important. It's important, the evidence will show for this reason. Susan's body has not been found yet, and it's inside a house. So obviously whoever sent that note knows Susan is dead, and the evidence going to show was her killer. Now, significantly, and I say significantly because the evidence is going to show, the word Beverly is spelled incorrectly. That will also turn out to be a key piece of evidence in this case. Now, the note was clearly sent again by her killer. Susan's dead body had not yet been discovered. Bob Durst was asked about this in 2011, excuse me.
2010.
Yeah, 2010, excuse me, thank you. I'm saying 11, I had it written down wrong. And Mr. Duras is going to say something here that is going to absolutely be true, but at the time that he says it, he has not agreed or admitted that he wrote the letter. This is what he's going to say.
You're writing a note to the police that only the killer could have written.
This is a more recent aerial view of Susan's neighborhood. The house has now been remodeled, but she lived at 1527. And as I said, Benedict Canyon is a busy street. It's small. On December 23rd, 2000, between 9 and 9:30 a.m., Dr. Marvin Karp, we're also going to have a stipulation from him. I'm sure we're going to play his testimony again. He's not going to testify live. He testified previously.
He will be live.
Oh, I take it back. You're right. I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Sometimes it's very hard for me to keep track of all of these witnesses. Yeah, I'm sorry. Dr. Karp is going to testify. And Dr. Karp is going to tell you that between 9 and 9:30 a.m. on December 23rd, he noticed the following.
Well, it was, I believe it was a Saturday, and I had awakened. I was walking around the house, then I went to the front of the house and opened the door, I suppose, and there I saw these two dogs loose, you know, just prancing around the lawn and so on and so in front of my house. So I encountered them for the first time, actually.
Now, Dr. Karp is going to testify that he knew that they were Susan's dogs and that they were never loose, and that in fact, again, in that neighborhood, you just don't have dogs running around. Following Dr. Karp's observations, over the next 24 hours, other neighbors attempted to contact Susan by phone. They also went over and knocked on the door and even peeked through the front window. However, Susan's body, because it was in another bedroom, was not visible from the window, so they couldn't see it. Now, they were able to see that the back door was wide open. And obviously, the circumstantial evidence demonstrates that the dogs got out the back door and out the gate, and that's why they were running around. Now, again, on December 24, 2000 at 12:21 p.m., Catherine Cutter called 911. That's the first thing I showed you in opening in what seems like a month ago, but it was actually yesterday. Officer Rashad Sharif and his fellow officers arrived at the residence at about 12:52 p.m. They made entry. They found her lifeless body, her cold lifeless body, on the bedroom office floor. Now, walking through the residence, Sharif made several important observations. There was a single 9mm expended shell casing found near Susan's body. No firearm was located. No forced entry. Windows locked and unbroken. No evidence of ransacking. No signs of a struggle. Nothing appeared to have been taken. Purse, credit cards sitting on the kitchen counter. Now, Dr. Mark Fajardo is a forensic pathologist. He was the coroner of Los Angeles County. He was the coroner of Riverside County, and now he is about to start as the coroner in Pierce County, Washington. He's going to testify to the following. He was not the original coroner who did the autopsy. That person's retired years ago. But he has reviewed all of the information. He's going to tell you the following. Susan had a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. That was a fatal wound. No evidence of livor mortis, rigor mortis, or alba mortis. He's going to tell you that meant that Susan had been dead for more than 24 hours. So remember, she's going to be found around 1 p.m. on the 24th. So that means she's been dead more than 24 hours, and he is saying at least. Dr. Ferraro also concluded that at the time the gun was fired, it was within an inch of the back of Susan's head. He's going to agree this was an execution type slang. And he's going to say that she was murdered approximately between 10:30 p.m. on December 22nd and 9:30 a.m. on the 23rd. Now, the evidence will show that Susan turned her back to the killer, but that the killer wanted Susan's body to be found. The evidence will show there was a relationship between the two of them. The evidence is going to show that Susan was extremely security conscious. Susan had a lot of phobias, a lot of issues, and one of them was she's kind of a paranoid New Yorker. You're going to hear from her friends and family that Susan would never have opened her door to a stranger, particularly in the middle of the night or early in the morning. Linda Opes is going to testify.
She was very paranoid. She shut her doors. I remember her once telling me I had not sufficient security.
And knowing the Susan that you know, was she the type to open the door to a stranger?
I mean, I certainly don't think so.
And in terms of the Susan that you know, was she the type of person that when she was home would have her door locked?
Absolutely.
Now, you're also going to hear from Al Cleathan. And Al Cleathan is going to talk about the whole procedure and process he had to go through if he was going to come over to see Susan, even if he was expected to be there.
On the occasions that you visited Susan Berman at her home in Benedict County, what was it like when you were arriving at her home and getting inside?
No, it wasn't easy. I mean, she was very protective, secretive, or I don't know where, but anyway, you had to knock. She would not answer her door. She had to know when you were coming over. The dog would bark, everything, and she would, you could hear them. But sometimes you'd not be there, and she would not,
When you would knock on the door, would she, occasions you were there, ever open the door without saying something to you through the door?
No.
Based on your knowledge of Susan Berman's habits and customs that she displayed to you, did she seem like the type of person who would open her front door to an unannounced stranger in the evening?
Never, no. She wouldn't.
Steve Silverman, Susan's friend, is also going to testify about just how kind of paranoid Susan was about her personal security.
No, Susan would not let a stranger into her house. She wouldn't even speak to a stranger at a party.
On January 7, 2001, Durst called Kim Langford, who was a mutual friend of both he and Susan. Kim explained to him, told him about the murder, and he sounded shocked. He also related to her during the conversation that he was scared about the reinvestigation into his wife, Kathy. However, in the BD story, Durst wrote instead that he did not learn about Susan's murder until January 9th, 2 days later. So that when he spoke to Kim Langford, he did not know Susan had been murdered, even though she testified that he was aware of it and they discussed it. And he said he learned about it through voicemail messages left by Julie Baumgold and Nick Chavin. That is the version Mr. Durst put in the BD story. He mentions nothing about the conversation with Kim Langford. Now, during his testimony in Galveston, Durst again told that same story of having learned of Susan's murder through the voicemail messages on January 9th. He went so far as to explain how he had confronted Susan's son, Sarah, for not having told him earlier about Susan's murder. Now, on January 11, 2001, Susan's murder investigation was transferred from LAPD's Pacific Division. And you're going to hear testimony that the way it works in Los Angeles is LAPD is divided up into many different stations. And so this murder occurred in what's called Pacific Division. So Pacific Division had the case. You know what, as I'm sitting here, and I might be wrong in this, I actually think it's West LA, and the detectives are nodding at me going, "You idiot, how many years can you..." Can I blame that on Mr. Milley, the Pacific Division? I keep doing that. I don't know why, but whenever I bring this up, I always have Pacific Division in my mind. That's my error. It was originally handled by West LA Division. And for certain high-profile cases, what can happen is LAPD has a unit called their Robbery Homicide Division. And the LAPD is called RHD. RHD is LAPD's elite homicide unit, and they will take charge of certain investigations at the onset, or they will come in later. And on January 11, 2001, they came in to take over this case. The RHD detectives assigned to the case were Paul Coulter and Jerry Stevens. Both are now retired. Jerry retired many years ago, and Paul Coulter retired basically around the end of 2012. Now, on February 1st, 2001, many of Susan's close friends, including witnesses you will hear from, Julie Smith and Nick Chavin, attended a memorial for her that was held at the Writers Guild Theater. Although not realized at the time, there were statements that were made at that. The BD story, which you will be receiving in new evidence, and Mr. Durst is at times having some of this information that you'll see in the BD story. Now, Durst continued to monitor the media for reports about the case, but remember, he is living at this point in time in Galveston as a mute woman. He has moved there in November. Susan's murder has happened the end of December, and he's back in Galveston. Ready for, let me just do a quick change. Okay, in March of 2001, Morris Black, 71-year-old drifter, rented a studio in a small boarding house in Galveston. That's going to be the boarding house that Mr. Durst was in. So remember, Bob Durst moves in there in November of 2000. He's there first. Morris moves in March of 2001. This is roughly 3 months after Susan is murdered. On March 9th, and again, much of this information is going to be from Mr. Durst himself. This is his version of what he is saying happened. Morris Black is obviously not going to be testifying. But on March 9th, according to Mr. Durst, Morris knocked on Durst's door and introduced himself. Now, although Morris was cheap and could be quite cantankerous, he and Durst ended up becoming fast friends.
I would describe Morris Black as being cantankerous in the extreme.
Give me an example of that.
Morris Black had opinions about anything, and he would express them to anybody, and he wanted you to get into a conversation with him, and if you didn't want to talk to him about whatever it was, he would argue with you.
So he had trouble making friends.
That's probably the biggest understatement I've heard in a long time. Morris Black made no friends with nobody, because he made everybody, he tried, he made everybody angry.
Now, shortly after he and Morris met, Durst stopped pretending being a mute woman in front of Morris.
Was there ever a moment when he said, "Hey, for the last couple of weeks you've been writing me notes and wearing a wig. Now you're not writing notes."
When we became friendlier as time went on in the following months, he asked about how come we're here, why'd you rent the apartment as Dorothy Seiner and like that? And I told him I wanted to disappear and hide. I think I'm hiding. I don't find anybody recognizing me.
And did he judge in any way? Did he say, "Oh, it's a weird thing to do"? Or?
No, it was just the opposite. He said, yeah, I did that a long time ago. Didn't say he changed his name or he dressed like a woman or anything. But yeah, when I said I just didn't want to be Robert Durst anymore, he said, yeah, I went through that.
Stevin's going to show that Morris Black was the only person in Galveston who knew that Bob Durst was Bob Durst. Now on March 19, 2001, Durst rented a second apartment in New Orleans for a man named Michael Ogden. Now once again, Durst assumed the disguise of a mute woman, this time using the identity of another person he had met named Diane Wynn. Now Durst testified at his Galveston trial that he also rented the New Orleans apartment as a mute woman, but that his intention was to eventually live in Galveston under his real name once everything went away. Now the New Orleans apartment, Mr. Durst is going to hear from him and the evidence we'll present, was his escape plan in case he ever had to quickly flee Galveston. We talked about the Beatty story briefly before. The Beatty story was authored by Durst, and it's a cheat sheet designed to chronicle the information that prosecuting attorneys in Galveston would and would not be able to disprove. So the entries in the Beatty story reflect Durst's fear that he was about to be charged in connection with Kathy's disappearance. Now in Galveston, Morris Black, although cantankerous, would purchase out of his own money eyeglasses to hand out to those he felt were in need through a charity called the Jesse Tree. And this was Morris Black's kind of own idea. Now the Jesse Tree was a faith-based organization in Galveston that was dedicated to providing services to different individuals who were in need. Now during the summer of 2001, and Morris is going to be murdered, People's Position, on September 28th. So we're now during the summer, we're a few months away from Morris being killed. During that summer, Morris became aware that Durst was from New York and that he had significant financial resources. So now he knows it's Robert Durst, and he knows he's from New York, and he knows he's got a lot of money. Ted Hanley ran the Jesse Tree charity. And at the time, the organization was trying to purchase a building, the charity, to further their services. He's going to testify that Morris told him that he, Morris, had been talking to someone who had a lot of money who might make the purchase of the building possible. The evidence is going to show that person Morris was referring to was Robert Durst. Now, Morris approached Durst with a request to fund the building purchase. In July 2001, at Morris's request, Durst, in an effort to determine whether Hanley's request was legitimate, disguised himself as a person in need and approached Hanley and asked him for $50 to get to Beaumont, Texas. It's a little bit confusing. So basically, Durst wants to figure out whether or not Hanley is legitimate. So Durst goes down there disguised as kind of a person down there, like a homeless person, and says, "Hey, will you give me $50? I need to get to Beaumont, Texas." That was apparently a test that Bob Durst wanted done, was doing. Meantime, when Morris's lease was up, their landlord, Klaus Dillman, you're going to hear, Klaus Dillman is very sick, might even have died by now. He's not going to testify. And in fact, he was not someone who was previously examined during these proceedings. However, he testified during the Galveston murder trial in 2003, and both sides have stipulated, have agreed, that the admissible parts of his testimony can be read in. So when Morris' apartment was up, Klaus sent Morris a letter telling him, you got to move out. When the letter arrived, Durst was not in Galveston. This, again, according to Mr. Durst. Now, the evidence is going to further show that Morris was the kind of person that would yell at other people in the building to turn off your light because it was a joint electric bill. He was very cheap, and he had no problem telling people what he thought. And he was a pain, no question about it. And Klaus Dillman had decided, you know what, I don't want to deal with this guy. Now, on July 25th, 2001, the TV show 2020 aired a nationwide episode on Kathy's disappearance. Mr. Durst was not in Galveston at the time. So meantime, what happened, even though he's living in Galveston disguised as a mute woman, Dorothy Seiner, he's got the place in New Orleans where he's a mute woman, Diane Wynn, but he also will travel around to different places in the country under his own name. And meantime, back in Galveston, he starts appearing at the location, and he is identified as Dorothy Seiner's nephew. So Bob Durst is basically living two different lives at the Galveston apartment. One is when he is in drag and he's Dorothy Seiner, and the other is when he is Dorothy Seiner's nephew, which is himself without the real name. And then he will use phony names. He does not use Robert Durst. On July 25th, 2001, they aired this nationwide episode. In August of 2001, Durst returns to Galveston. And according to Durst, in the BD story, I believe, or maybe it's in a statement he's given, but you'll hear that evidence, Morris told him that he was being evicted by their landlord. Now, after the eviction notice, Morris was pressuring Durst, who he knew had a lot of money, to buy a house that they could live in together. And again, how do we know this information? We know it from Bob Durst.
And then he got a letter from the landlord that said, get out. And they have open houses all the time in Galveston. It's something people do. Houses turn over very infrequently. And we have been going to open houses for a while. And he had sort of made it known, well, if you buy this house, there'll be plenty of room for me. And this is true, there would have been plenty of room for him, except that personality takes up all of everything, and I didn't want him living with me. And I thought about buying a house there as a place to go sometime, but I wasn't going to live in Galveston full time if I was going to be Robert Durst.
Now, during this period of time, Durst was continuing to structure money. And the evidence is going to show this is in preparation for his plan to flee Galveston. During the trial in Galveston, Mr. Durst was asked, how much money had you accumulated by the third week of September of 2001? And his answer was $500,000 to $600,000. So Mr. Durst is preparing to flee Galveston, but there's a loose end, and his name is Morris Black. On September 25th, 2001, 3 days before Morris Black would be murdered, Mr. Durst began moving out of his Galveston apartment and checked into the very luxurious nearby San Luis resort.
And that was pretty much getting close to when I was leaving. And either right before that or right after that, I went and I took a room in the San Luis Hotel because there were some things I wanted to finish before I gave the apartment back to Klaus Dillman. I'd already told him I'm leaving.
So you came back to the apartment and Morris was in the apartment?
Yes, that was the end of it. I had already moved to the San Luis Hotel. I had taken all my clothes and stuff out. I had a flight on Monday. I was going back to New York and do it. I had already made plans. And he knew it. I wasn't keeping it a secret. I always thought the possibility I'm going to come back. I might buy a house. I might have a summer house here. But I'm leaving.
So the evidence is going to show that here we are 3 days before Morris Black is going to die. And Bob Durst is saying that, one, Morris Black knows who he is, knows he's got a lot of money, knows that he is from New York, and circumstantially the evidence will demonstrate that he knows Bob Durst's situation. And there's another problem that the evidence is going to show, is that Morris Black is pressuring Bob Durst to get a house with him. Mr. Durst, the evidence will show, it's not a secret that he's leaving. So he is about to leave, he's moving out, and Morris Black wants him to get a house. That's going to be the circumstances right before Morris Black is going to be murdered. September 28th. This is going to prove to be the last day of Morris Black's life. Now, Durst's account...
Sorry to interrupt. He said murder. Yeah. The jury found him innocent.
No, they found him not guilty.
Okay.
Did not find him innocent.
Not much difference.
Oh, it's different.
Oh, no.
But now, there he goes again, Judge.
This is a speaking objection. I don't allow them. So,
what about counsel addressing me, Your Honor?
No, you should not, Mr. Lewin, and nor should you address Mr. Lewin.
I didn't.
All right. All right. So, Mr. Durst was acquitted of murder in that case. He's no longer in jeopardy in that case. The facts of that case may be relevant in this trial in a different context. They may have a different meaning in the context of other evidence that the parties present. And so you will be allowed to consider that evidence. Mr. Lewin used the term murder, and this is an opening statement. This is not argument. This is not evidence. This is what Mr. Lewin is telling you he intends to prove. If he uses the term murder, that means he intends to prove that that incident was a murder. But whether or not it's a murder or it is not really the point. The point is that the facts of that incident may be relevant to this trial. You may continue.
What the people intend to prove is that this was not accident, it was not self-defense, that Bob Durst killed Morris Black intentionally. There's going to be evidence that Mr. Durst was acquitted, found not guilty. He was not found innocent. It's not what jurors do. Jury made a determination that the evidence that was presented at Galveston at that trial did not meet the burden. We're going to be presenting evidence in this case, and we're going to be arguing that factually what happened was not self-defense or accident, that factually it was murder. But Mr. Durst is not on trial for that murder, and the judge will be instructing you as to how that evidence can be used. So when I say that he murdered Bob Durst, or he murdered Morris Black, I'm not telling you that the jury found that he murdered Morris Black. The jury acquitted him. I'm telling you what the evidence I'm going to present is going to demonstrate. So Durst's account at trial of what happened can actually be traced back to exactly what he wrote in the BD story prior to his testimony. Again, the BD story served as a checklist of what he could and could not lie about. That's what the evidence is going to show. Not surprisingly, the testimony largely mirrored what he said in the BD story, and you're going to have that evidence, and I'm skipping through, I'm not going to read through it all right now. However, it will be impeached by Durst's prior and subsequent statements about it, the physical evidence relating to the case, and overall common sense. That's what evidence we will put on. Now, September 28th, Durst was still staying at the San Luis Resort. According to the BD story and his testimony, around 5:45 a.m., he drove his Honda CR-V to the B'nai Israel Temple and parked the car. The temple was about a mile from Durst's apartment at 2213 Avenue K. At around 6 a.m., after what Mr. Durst described as a short jog, he arrived at 2213 Avenue K. Durst allegedly entered his apartment and found Morris uninvited inside. This is what he says happened.
He was in the apartment. I could hear the TV from outside. Opened up the door, ready to start. Oh, and also, since I'd taken the key away, he must have made an extra key. And that worked through my mind right away. He's in the apartment. He made an extra key. Walk into the apartment. He's sitting at the table. There's a yellow thing on a sweater or whatever, jacket, on top of the table. And I'm, primed. Morris, get out of here, period. I'm leaving, get out. I don't ever want to see you again. He takes the gun out from under whatever the yellow thing is on the table. I grab him and the gun, and we fall down in the kitchen. The gun goes off and shoots him in the side of the face.
Now, the evidence is going to show that when you listen to Mr. Durst to that statement, Mr. Durst starts off and he says that opened up the door, ready to start yell, and then he stops and he says, oh, and also since I'd taken the key away. The evidence is going to demonstrate that when Mr. Durst is telling this story to Mr. Jarecki, that he realizes as he's telling the story, wait a minute, I've already taken the key away. How does he get in there? And he quickly says, he must have made an extra key. He also, if you listen to the end of that exchange, the evidence is going to demonstrate, says that I grabbed him and the gun and we fall down in the kitchen. The gun goes off and shoots him in the side of the face. Mr. Durst is describing the gun as if it had a mind of its own and that the gun is shooting Morris. No one could stop it. Now, Durst was asked how he felt about what happened, because he's now described this horrible situation where Mr. Black, his friend, has allegedly tried to kill him. When you listen to the statement, there's something Mr. Durst isn't going to mention about how he felt.
And how did you feel when that happened?
Shocked, amazed, overwhelmed, astonished. My elbow hurt. Scared.
What the evidence to show Mr. Durst did mention was sorry or horrified or mournful that his friend had just died. Then it's going to demonstrate that the reason Mr. Durst didn't voice those feelings is because he didn't have them. Now, Mr. Durst described his thoughts and feelings immediately of how he felt immediately after the shooting. And this is, again, this is in the December 2010 interviews with Jarecki and Smurley.
And so suddenly that was it. He was dead.
Yes, he was dead.
And then, now you're in your apartment, Galveston, Texas.
Dead.
And
I sat down on the bed for hours trying to figure out what I'm going to do.
And then what went through your mind?
I can't go to the police. I can't go to the police. I can't go to the police. The police are going to want to investigate it and ask me a zillion questions. And from the outset, I'm going to say, well, my name is Robert Durst, and I rented this apartment disguised as a woman named Dorothy Seiner. I mean, I could just picture myself going to the police precinct to report this. My name is Robert Durst. I rented this $300 a month apartment disguised as a woman named Dorothy Seiner. My neighbor is lying on the kitchen floor with a bullet wound in his face. He's dead. The bullet came from my gun. Oh, and this is an accident. Oh, and by the way, I'm a rich guy from New York, and my first wife disappeared, and I was never charged, but there was lots of speculation that I did it. And they're going to arrest me. What else could they possibly do?
The next image is disturbing. I'm just going to give you a warning. On September 30th, 2001, a young boy fishing with his father discovered a human torso floating in Galveston Bay. Responded, and divers found garbage bags. Now, when we say divers, they weren't really divers. It's very shallow there, and they were basically just on their hands and knees. They weren't using scuba equipment and just gathering the evidence. You're going to hear a substantial amount of evidence that Mr. Durst picked a very bad place to dump the body because Galveston Bay is very shallow, and he put it in garbage bags which float, and that they didn't go anywhere. They came up to shore. So inside the garbage bags, investigators found body parts. Divers searched, again, these very shallow Galveston Bay for evidence. However, and very significantly, all the body parts were found except for Morris's head.
So what did you decide to do to get rid of the body?
Well, I decided I'd wait till night and I'd pick it up and carry it out of there. And then I
want to stop you. As you listen to the next clip, 1 second. Mr. Durst is going to describe what he did with the body. And as you're listening, very early he's going to say, and then I realized I wasn't picking up that body and carrying it anywhere because it was much, and then he hesitates. Please listen.
So what did you decide to do to get rid of the body?
Well, I decided I'd wait till night and I'd pick it up and carry it out of there. And then I realized I wasn't picking up that body and carrying it anywhere because it was much. I mean, I wasn't strong enough to do it. I could drag it out, but I just couldn't see. I mean, I thought about putting it in a sleeping bag or something and then dragging the whole thing out, but good God, that's ridiculous.
So you decided instead?
I decided to. It wasn't until the next day when I can't just drag it out. I'm going to have to dismember this body.
Now the evidence is going to show, circumstantially, that when he said, "I'm not taking that body anywhere," that was a reference to Kathy Durst and how he had gotten rid of that body.
That's that's clearly an argument and conclusion and speculation.
Circumstantial. Was it? I'm sorry, Your Honor.
I'll sustain it. Move on.
I asked the jury be instructed in this regard.
It's a close call. I do think it relies on inference. It's technically, I would call it an argument. So I'm sustaining the objection. Disregard it, ladies and gentlemen.
Now, as you listen to Mr. Durst's voice, the evidence is going to demonstrate, as he's describing this, it's as if he's constructing a shed or building something in the backyard. You don't hear any remorse, you don't hear any sorrow, you don't hear any pain, you don't hear any regret.
I went back and I realized I couldn't lift it, I couldn't drag it out, I was going to have to dismember it. And then I went to Chalmers Hardware Store, and now Morris had tools. He had saws and axes, a giant axe. I don't think he had a bow saw. Anyway, I went and bought a bow saw, and I got a bunch of garbage bags and stuff like that, and went back to the house, and I'm sure I got more stoned and more drunk, and I dismembered the corpse, primarily with the axe, but some with the bow saw, and I think another saw that Morris Black had. Took the body parts and put everything else there that was bloody, whatever it was, that I ended up cleaning up the place with, put them in the garbage bags, and that night I put the garbage bags in my SUV and drove to find some place to dump the garbage bags. It immediately became obvious to me I'd dump them in the water, they'll sink, nobody would have seen them, the garbage bags are heavy, And that's what I did.
As you're listening and reviewing this evidence, when it will be played for you during the presentation of evidence at the actual trial after opening statement, the evidence is going to demonstrate that when Mr. Durst is talking about Morris Black, he doesn't refer to him as Morris. I couldn't lift it. I couldn't drag it out. I was going to have to dismember it. The evidence is going to show that Morris Black ceased being even a person to Bob Durst. In addition, as he's describing, if you review the evidence, as he's describing what he does, and he's talking about whether he used the giant axe or the saw, at one point he literally says, anyway, it's a very casual attitude that the evidence is going to demonstrate is not just inconsistent with an accidental killing or killing in self-defense. In any event. Mr. Durst was also asked about the manner in which he had dismembered the body. And he denied that it took any special experience. The way that he describes it, though, as you listen to him, he's very technical as you listen to what he has to say.
You know that the way the body was cut, somebody knew how to cut the joints.
You see, I don't know that. Subsequently, I've been told that a surgeon would cut up a body the same way you would chicken. You go into the joint and you cut around the joint to get rid of all the ligaments, and then the thing comes out. You're not going to go and try to cut through the goddamn bone like I did, which was hard.
Well, you did a pretty good job. The thing that
cutting through a bone is not easy with anything. I know that cutting up that body the way I was doing it was the hard way. The proper way is what a surgeon would do with a scalpel, and he would cut around the ligaments and then do it in the joint, not on the bone.
Would you agree, Bob, that somebody who could dismember somebody like that, you can understand why we would suspect you of having killed?
That's what Kathy, Mother, and what Gilberti, and I'm sure the other ones think. I give it to Kathy.
Now the evidence is going to demonstrate that I couldn't get out even my sentence. All that I said was why we would suspect you of having killed. And Mr. Durst finished the sentence for me. He brought up Kathy. He brought up the dismemberment. He brought up people's suspicions. Now, during the 2010 interviews with Jarecki and Smerling, they also discussed what Bob Durst had done with Morris's body parts. And he explains exactly what happened. Now, at one point, no, it's the next slide.
Took the body parts and put everything else there that was bloody or whatever it was that I ended up cleaning up the place with, put them in the garbage bags, and that night I put the garbage bags in my SUV and drove to find some place to dump the garbage bags. It immediately became obvious to me I'd dump them in the water, they'll sink, nobody would have seen them, the garbage bags are heavy, and that's what I did.
So you drove to Galveston Bay.
Yeah, I drove around for a while because I had to get to some place on the bay where I could put the car near a pier or whatever you want to call it. I couldn't take it that way. I couldn't go to the beach and leave the car at the seawall and walk down the beach with my garbage bags. And besides that, it was a typical beach, but a particular Gulf beach where it went very gradually. It didn't get deep until you were way out. So I had to find a place along the bay, and I drove around for a while until I found one.
In the next clip, it's going to be slightly confusing. Mr. Durst, very briefly when he's talking, is going to mix up floating and sinking. So when you're listening, he's going to correct himself, but it's a little bit confusing.
So you basically just decided you were going to...
I figured it was deep. Going to drop it, it's going to sink. Who cares where the tide is going? It's underwater, nobody's going to see it.
Right. But the bags didn't sink?
No.
What happened?
They floated.
Because of the air that was in the bag?
Well, seemingly body parts float. Also, when I first, when people were first asking, just because they're heavy doesn't mean they float. And I'm told that aircraft carriers don't float. I mean, this is all something I know, but I didn't think about that at all. Because it's heavy doesn't mean it's going to float. Trees are heavy, they don't float. They do float. It doesn't mean it's going to sink. Just because it's heavy doesn't mean it's going to sink.
Now, the evidence is going to show that, much like the alibi with Bill Mayer, and much like numerous other situations in this case, that Mr. Durst did not spend much intellectual energy or capital trying to figure out how he was going to cover up his crime. But it had worked. This was 2001. He'd never been charged with Kathy. He'd gotten away with Susan. Now, in searching the garbage bags, investigators discovered a newspaper. So Bobdor takes the body parts and he puts them in a bag with a newspaper that has the address of where they live. Now, they respond to that location and ultimately determine that the body parts inside the bag belong to Morris Black. Now, eventually, Mr. Durst is going to end up being confronted with, in essence, why would you leave a newspaper with the address? And Mr. Durst's response is going to be very revealing. His response is going to be, and I'll get to it in a second, to the effect of, well, it doesn't matter because they were never supposed to find the body parts anyway, so why does it matter if there's a bag in there? Now, investigators later discovered that Morris's neighbor, Dorothy Seiner, was in fact Robert Durst. And they soon realized that it was Durst who had killed and dismembered Morris.
Now, if you were trying to get rid of the body in a way that wasn't going to be traceable back to you, why wouldn't you make sure that the garbage bags were empty before you put the body parts in them? Why would you have done something as careless as leaving?
I wasn't going to give the police the body parts. I mean, if they got the body parts, they'd know where he lived. I mean, the police weren't supposed to get the body parts. What difference did it make what was in the bags?
It wasn't the only thing he left in the bags. There was also a receipt from Chalmers Hardware Store. The receipt was for a purchase on September 28, 2001 at 12:17 p.m. The items purchased were trash bags and a drop cloth. Now, I want you to bear in mind that the evidence is going to show that the timing of what occurred, some of it is based on what Mr. Durst says, and some of it is based on what neighbors have said. And you're going to hear from those individuals. So investigators would ultimately learn that prior to going to the hardware store, Durst went to Bank of America to structure more cash. Now, he testified at his Galveston trial that by this date, again, he had structured between $500,000 and $600,000. He also, at his Galveston trial, described that it was his plan that he had formulated after Morris's death, what he intended to do. He said, I was going to make it appear that Morris Black had moved out of apartment K. So in essence, what he was going to do, never to come back again. The evidence is going to show it was a tried and true strategy, tried and true operation, because he had done the same thing in 1982 with Kathy, and it had worked. At trial, Bob Durst testified that he decided to go back to 2213, that's where they lived, and take Morris's clothes and belongings and discard them. He basically is going to clean out the apartment. Again, the evidence is going to show he did the same thing with Kathy. He testified, I thought that if Klaus did not get the check on Monday, October the 1st, he would come over to the building. So, according to Mr. Durst's testimony, he's just had this horrible, unplanned, Morris Black has tried to kill him. He's had to now dismember the corpse, but he's thinking alertly and sharply enough that, you know what, it's almost October 1st, and I better get Klaus his rent or he's going to come over there. He said, at first I figured I would just fill in the check and mail it, but then I remembered the way Morris did the checks was certainly unique. So Bob Durst, the evidence is going to show, has the presence of mind in this state of whatever it was to remember, hey, Morris does his checks a certain way, and I better duplicate that. And in fact, at his trial, he referred to, you're going to get the testimony, he referred to his mental state after the killing as he was in a fugue state, didn't know what was going on. The evidence is going to show he knew what was going on well enough to do the things that we've just described. Now, investigators would later obtain surveillance video from First Convenience Bank. Now, this is located inside the Galveston Walmart. So, again, after Morris's killing, that same day, Bob Durst has the presence of mind to go to Walmart and to go get a money order to pay Morris's rent. He then mailed the money order to the landlord, Klaus Dillman. Now, investigators later learned that that evening, September 28th, Mr. Durst returned to the San Luis resort. Now, remember, according to his testimony, someone's just tried to kill him. Morris's body is just lying dead in his residence. The evidence will show that won't be the last time that happens. And he goes back to the resort, and the evidence will show that he is so disturbed over what's happened that he gets a haircut at the spa, and then he orders room service, and he remembers fried chicken, salad, turkey club. Should be chips, it says clips. Chips and a Guinness. The next day, according to Mr. Durst, he woke up, went to Morris' apartment, and executed his plan to make it appear that Morris had left town. He then returned to his own apartment, where he allegedly unsuccessfully tried to roll Morris up in the carpet. Remember, Morris was killed in Bob's apartment because Morris had copied a key and gotten back in there. He then makes the, he says, difficult decision to dismember Morris's body. Now, according to Bob Durst, he goes to Economy Liquor. He buys a fifth of Jack Daniels whiskey. Depending on how you do it, that's 21 to 32 shots of whiskey, and just about finishes the entire bottle before returning to Chalmers to buy more supplies. He then returned to his apartment and, apparently immune to the effects of this large amount of whiskey he's just consumed, dismembers Morris' body with, he says, an axe and various saws. Now, around midnight, he says that he took those body parts, put them in garbage bags, threw them in the Honda CR-V, and dumped them into Galveston Bay. Now, we know that happened. Around noon the next day, he returns to the body dump site, and he sees the bags are now floating near the water's edge. At 8 or 9 p.m., he again goes back to the site, and he sees police activity at the location. Well, he immediately turned around and returned to the San Luis resort. The following day, October 1st, remember, although they are collecting Morris's body parts, it's very interesting. You're going to hear evidence that detectives went over to the location on October 1st, but they went there after Bob Durst had left. And he went back to collect the marijuana he had hidden in the freezer. Got to have priorities. He then fled to New Orleans. Now, to execute his plan, he's going to go live as Diane Wynn in that escape residence. Meanwhile, a few hours after Durst fled, investigators, they've now made the connection to the address, and they go over there. They respond to the location. They subsequently obtained a warrant, and they searched both apartment units. Now, although Bob Durst had cleaned both apartments, there was still some evidence of blood. They later searched the contents of the garbage cans that were behind the residence. So these are going to be like the garbage cans that go for not just Bob Durst, but everybody in that apartment. What do they find? They find a Ruger 22mm target pistol. Now, that's going to turn out to be the murder weapon. Bob Durst is going to deny ever having cleaned the gun, but there's no blood found anywhere on that weapon. Now, records revealed that Bob Durst had purchased that gun on August 30th, 2001.